Robert Palmer, thanks for coming to do this interview. You're director of the Tax Justice Network, and you've just been participating in a seminar we've held about the future of tax and spend in Britain and where we go. But could you just kick off by telling us about the Tax Justice Network and what you're trying to achieve?
So my organisation is the UK Tax Justice Network, and what we want to achieve is for everyone in the UK to benefit from a fair and effective tax system. At the moment, there just isn't an organisation out there really making the positive case for tax, and the fact that tax is one of the greatest levers we have to get towards the sort of society I think most of us want to see, with well-funded public services, an NHS that can look after us when we get ill, a social safety net for if we end up unemployed or when we become older. And so we're going to be out there making the positive case for tax and pushing for reform of the tax system so it is fairer and more effective.
Now, we've just had a discussion this morning telling us essentially that the current trends, if they continue, are not really sustainable, that the amount of money we raise for tax lies behind where we are in expenditure. But one of the core problems is when you suggest raising tax, people say, well, we're not prepared to pay. We don't trust the money's being well spent. We're not sure it's being spent on what we want to see. There's a widespread public opposition to raising taxes, which really goes back politically to the days of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. How do you contest that? How do you deal with that, I would say, political reality?
Yeah, I think the politics of tax rises are always going to be difficult. Most people won't necessarily want to pay more tax, or at least willingly pay more tax. But I think we are starting to see a shift in public opinion and to some extent the political debate around tax rises. We've had 8 years of austerity, we've had government cuts, we've had repeated stories of crises, especially in the NHS. And you're seeing in some of the polling that there is starting to be increased willingness from the public to pay more taxes. Now, I think you alluded to the fact that at the moment there's probably quite a lot of distrust from the public and people don't necessarily know where their taxes are going. And I think that's a big challenge for any politician that is going to the public and saying, we need to take a bit more money from you so we can provide a bit more public services. So the public really needs to have faith that their tax money is being spent wisely.
I think that's certainly true, and it also requires people to know that if they're giving their money to the government's spending its money well. And there are serious doubts about that as you look at different parts of government, their stories of government efficiency and so on. How do you deal with those problems of, at least of perception, and possibly even of reality, that money is wasted by government in certain areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely public concern about the fact that government money is wasted. But I also think, lots of people do understand that if we want to have decent health care, decent social care for us when we get old or our parents when they get old, that is going to cost more money. And I think that the public will be open for an honest debate from politicians who say, we have a couple of choices. We could either shrink the state, shrink the sort of services that you get, which frankly, I don't think there is the political appetite for, or actually we're going to have to pay a bit more money to get a bit better services. But I think it will be really important for the government also to say, we're going to start by asking those who have the broadest shoulders to pay more of any tax rises. And that's not just focusing on, the top 1%, but kind of looking at those at the top of both the income and the wealth spectrum and saying, actually, we are going to ask you for a bit more money to fund the sort of services you want to see.
So there are obviously a large range of different taxes that we say. Do you simply say we should get this extra tax revenue which we need? And I certainly agree with you, there is a broad acceptance of that argument by raising all taxes together. Or should we be targeting different taxes which need to be raised in different ways? Should we be approaching direct taxation in the same way as we approach, value-added tax or corporation tax or whatever? Do you have an approach and strategy towards raising taxes to say which taxes are the ones we should be focusing on and others we should be leaving alone?
So I think something we should start to think about is how we tax how we tax people's assets and wealth and property. And at the moment in this country, we undertax assets and wealth and property. And so there are some...
Sorry, excuse me, Rob, when you say undertax, do you mean by comparison with other countries?
Sorry, yes.
By comparison with what we should be doing? Well, could you just elaborate that point a little more?
I would say by comparison with other countries and by comparison with what we used to do in the UK. And in the sort of like tax wonk policy making spaces, there's quite a lot of agreement about some of the things that we should look at. So, for example, at the moment, income tax is higher than capital gains tax. We could work to moving them closer together. We could rethink how we tax property, particularly at the moment. Council tax is really unequal and hits some of the poorest people hardest. And there's a sort of cap in terms of how much you can pay. So there's a bunch of things that we could do around that would, I think, raise more money. I think what we should avoid doing is saying, okay, we're going to go for really the sort of hard-working middle who haven't had a tax rise, the hard-working middle who really haven't had a pay rise in almost 8 years. So I think there's a balance of things that we need to be doing. One final point I would say is this current government has engaged in a bit of a race to the bottom when it comes to how we tax companies. And what's really interesting is that you have business groups who are saying, whoa, 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 we don't need the tax cuts that you're giving us. I mean, it feels incredible that you have places like the CBI saying, we don't actually want more cuts in corporation tax rate. And also by doing this race to the bottom, it undermines the taxes and the tax systems in other countries. So I think there's a bunch of things that we could look at, shoring up how we tax companies, thinking about better how we tax wealth and assets, but also making sure that the real burden doesn't fall on those who haven't had pay rises.
It seems to me it's a very gutsy thing you're going for. I mean, traditionally, if there's any tax increase proposed in any area, there's immediately a call from the media, from people, for the politicians to rule it out. So there's no particular proposal that's made. That's, for example, why we've never had a revaluation of the council tax base in the last couple of decades. In this, I would say, hostile media environment to the argument you're making, how do you take it on? How do you make the case that you are wanting to put forward?
So I think you need to be making a broad case around why tax is important, why tax is positive, the kind of like making the case that actually, and I think most people will understand this, in order to have good public services, we need to have decent taxes and decent tax coming in, and that also there isn't a magic money tree where we can just go after companies or just go after the wealthy or just go after tax evasion. That's not going to bring in the sort of money that we need. And I think it's going to be a slow process, but you're starting to see politicians of both the left and the right starting to make these sorts of cases. And I think it's probably also wrapped up in an increasing concern that people have around the differences between different generations. So older generations that have had quite a lot of support from the state have had huge rises in the prices of their property and their assets. Younger generations who can't buy houses, you have to be really wealthy or have help from your parents to be able to buy a house in London or the southeast at the moment. So I think there is an openness for this debate and discussion, and I think in the long term it is the debate that we need to be having. I think we can't just keep pushing it off or trying to find sneaky ways of bringing in more money, because in the long term that just isn't going to work.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's extremely interesting.